Good afternoon, colleagues. If you can take your seats, we'll start. We'd like to welcome parties and observer organizations to the fourth and final session of the second meeting under the ad hoc work program on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. As you recall, on Sunday we produced a further updated version of the input paper. Yesterday we had an initial round of views on commonalities that you see in the various sections of the further updated input paper. Colleagues, with 26 remaining speakers on the speakers list, we'd like to continue hearing your views on commonalities that you see in the various sections of the document. This is including but not limited to the sections on principles, access and transparency arrangements, so you don't have to limit yourself to those issues. We'd also like to remind parties to be targeted and precise to allow all speakers to share their views and to provide us with some time towards the end so that in this session we can lay out the way forward between now and the third meeting. Before we start with the speakers list, I'd like to remind everybody that we only have this room till 5 o'clock. We do not have an opportunity for another session at this meeting. So 5 o'clock is the hard deadline for us on this. In terms of the speakers list, first speaker on the list we have is Gabby. But before I give Gabby, yes, you asked for the floor, Gabby. Didn't you ask for the floor, Gabby? Oh, sorry. Secretariat?
No.
We'd like to... Happy birthday, Gabby. We have from the co-chairs and the secretariat a small gift for you. So you can collect it after the session. Including a black belly sheep from Ricardo. So I'm going to go through the speakers list that I have before me, noting that yesterday we had around 21, 22 speakers and we didn't have enough time to go through all the speakers. So please, I urge you to be very brief, precise in your interventions. I have on my speakers list South Africa, Iran, Kuwait, Barbados, Iraq, Marshall Islands, Saudi Arabia, EU, Fiji, Nigeria, Morocco, India, Oman, Armenia, Australia, Maldives, China, Japan, Bangladesh, Zambia, Bolivia, Honduras, Kenya, UK, Singapore, Ecuador, and if we have time, NGO representatives. So that's the speakers list I have before me. With that, I give the floor to South Africa.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. We associate with the statement made by Argentina on behalf of the G77 and China yesterday, as well as the Africa Group. I'd like to just start off to thank both of the co-chairs for the hard work that you've undertaken over the last few weeks in trying to put this text together, and to really try and ensure that all of the parties are being taken along on the process. This is no easy task. However, we do share the concerns expressed by some parties yesterday that the text is very imbalanced. We see the imbalance in the following ways. Firstly, in terms of how the proposals of developing and developed countries have been reflected in the text. Seemingly, a lot of the developing country inputs have been streamlined. Secondly, there is misalignment in the allocation of obligations and responsibility in the text, with a great emphasis of obligation being put on developing countries, while developed countries' contributions are seemingly voluntary or offset to developing countries, which we cannot agree to. The principle of historical responsibility and equity and CBDR remains critical. Thirdly, the text does not reflect many of the key concerns that have been repeatedly raised by developing countries, such as the disenablers, which are, for example, access to capital, the cost of capital, unilateral policy measures, amongst others that have significant implications on climate and sustainability. Fourthly, there is an imbalance on how the core elements are reflected. The quantum is the core of the NCQG, and only once we have the understanding of the quantum, the time frame, and the instruments can we start considering the other elements. To ensure that developed countries are in a position to increase ambition, the quantum needs to be informed by the needs of developing countries based on the NDCs, the NAPs, the GST outcomes, and other reporting. As we have said in previous engagements, the calls for ambitious action need to be met with ambitious finance, which the Africa Group estimates at $1.3 trillion per annum. The financing instruments are a critical part of this discussion. Within the context of a volatile global economy, debt sustainability challenges, and constrained fiscal space in developing countries, we cannot accept market rate loans as climate finance. We need to see grants and highly concessional finance being the mainstay of the goal. The financing channels are also important. We would also want to see a commitment to scale up the allocation of finance to the financing mechanism and its implementing entities. This remains critical to ensure that we avoid a fragmentation of climate finance, which impacts the scale of projects that can be undertaken through these instruments. On the access section, we would have one high-level comment. We support the options to improve access and make it easier to access finance. We think it would be particularly valuable to emphasize the need to harmonize the access requirements to bilateral finance, which is also severely fragmented. On the transparency arrangement, it is important that this goal has the right transparency mechanism in place. We align to the comments made by the Africa Group on transparency and want to emphasize that the reporting frameworks outlined in Article 9.5 and Article 9.7 are critical and need to be clearly incorporated in the section. Moving forward, it would also be useful to have a sense of how this process will move forward with timeframes on when we can expect to receive the next iteration of the input paper. It would also be useful to get a sense of the possible elements of a framework text ahead of the next meeting of the ad hoc work program. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, South Africa. Next, I have Iran.
Thank you, Co-Chair. My delegation aligns itself with G77 and China, LMDC, and a group. Thank you, Co-Chair, for preparing the new version of the text. However, from our point of view, the text is still very imbalanced and includes elements that do not align with the nature of the NCQG. Developed and developing countries clearly have different responsibilities under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, and we cannot accept any new interpretation of commitments and responsibilities of these countries. In this regard, any reference to contributors and recipients should be removed from the text, other than the contributors are developed and recipients are all developing countries, according to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. As we mentioned before, targeting a specific industry and energy sector in developing countries under the NCQG is not acceptable, as clearly there isn't any consensus about that, so should be removed from the text. There is no time to lose in this regard, providing concrete proposals that are consistent with the mandate of the NCQG, as well as principles of the Convention and the Paris Agreement, including CBDR and equity is necessary. And we should make sure that NCQG aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty and making finance flows consistent with pathways towards sustainable development and climate resilient development. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Iran. Kuwait.
We just arrived. Could you give us the next turn, please?
Barbados.
Thank you, Chair. We have requested to switch with Maldives in the speaking order.
Okay, Kuwait, you ready?
I'll just open the laptop. Thank you so much for your patience.
Iraq.
Yes, thank you very much, Co-Chair, for your efforts in these matters. We really
Sorry,
appreciate
Iraq.
that.
We were
yes.
just asking to switch with Maldives in the speaking order, Chair.
Yeah, no, I took that. So you want Maldives to speak in your place?
Yes.
Okay, Maldives.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and thank you, Barbados. The Maldives takes the floor today on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States and will deliver the following intervention jointly with the Gambia on behalf of the LDCs, based on the joint LDC and AOSIS submission on the NCQG, which was uploaded earlier today onto the UNFCCC submission portal and has been sent to the co-chairs and the Secretariat.
Thank you, Maldives, and thank you, co-chairs as well. We recall the international recognition and commitment to address the special needs and circumstances of least developed countries, and the special case and circumstances of small island developing states. We further recall the international endorsement of the Doha Program of Action for least developed countries for the decade 2022 to 2031, and the Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for Small Island Developing States of 2024. We also recall that seeds and LDCs represent 76 of the 174 non-Annex II parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is 43% of those parties. And 155 non-Annex I parties of the UNFCCC, that is 49% of those parties. We acknowledge that LDCs and seeds account for less than 4% and 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, respectively. Yet, we are home to some of the world's most climate vulnerable populations and ecosystems. We further note with deep concern that the 100 billion goal per year by 2020 goal lacked adequacy and precision in targeted finance to LDCs and seeds, notwithstanding the recognition of their special needs, case, or circumstances as articulated in the international climate change regime and the applicable international law more broadly. We further recall that Article 9.4 and 9.5 of the 2015 Paris Agreement have not fully operationalized prioritization of LDCs and seeds in relation to the provision and mobilization of climate finance, given our particular vulnerability to the adverse effects of climate change and the significant capacity constraints, as well as the respective special needs, special case, and circumstances of the two groups. In recognition of the above, we hereby jointly present the following high priorities for COP29 in relation to the NCQG adoption: reaffirming of the commitments by all parties to accelerate climate action within this decade based on the best available science, equity, and the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, in the light of different national circumstances, including transitioning away from fossil fuel in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. Furthermore, reaffirming of our commitments by all parties to undertake rapid emission reductions in accordance with the best available science so as to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emission by sources and removal by sinks of greenhouse gases well before 2050. NCQG must aim to support all developing countries in effectively implementing the Paris Agreement within the context of these commitments. NCQG must, at a minimum, include loss and damage response alongside mitigation and adaptation as respective sub-goals. Climate finance provided and mobilized must be new and additional to any finance classified as official development assistance and other official flows and finance committed under the international regime, as opposed to retargeted or repurposed ODA and finance committed under other international regimes, and recognizing that all these types of finance and assistance needs to be scaled up respectively in their various contexts.
I will now go over the specific asks from LDCs and SIDS that both our groups want to be reflected in the NCQG. There is a need for scaled-up financial resources and targeted provision to LDCs and SIDS to meet our needs based on the best available science. We must ensure efficient and effective access to financial resources, in particular for LDCs and SIDS. We need all channels, which includes bilateral, regional, and multilateral channels, to undertake specific measures to enhance access for LDCs and SIDS, which could include creating minimum allocation floors for our groups, in particular for adaptation and loss and damage response, standardizing and prioritizing direct access for our national and regional institutions, including our local non-governmental and community-based organizations, and ensuring that concessionality level of climate finance provided and mobilized must take into account our levels of debt sustainability. Next, financial resources provided and mobilized for adaptation and loss and damage response shall be primarily public and grant-based resources with the highest level of concessionality given to LDCs and SIDS. Transactions for readiness support and transparency support shall be solely public and grant-based resources, in particular for LDCs and SIDS. Transparency arrangements must require disaggregation of data or information provided to or mobilized for SIDS and LDCs, specifically regarding climate finance that has been accessed and the types of instruments used. There is a need to address systemic inequities to access for developing country parties, in particular LDCs and SIDS, including, among other things, the high cost of capital, high transition costs, capacity constraints, and indiscriminate assumptions of corruption. We also want to underscore the importance of cost of capital being well below medium-term growth rates for our countries. And lastly, the need for all LDCs and SIDS to be included in the common framework for debt treatments beyond the debt services suspension initiative, and to expand debt suspension to also include debt relief, debt forgiveness, and debt servicing assistance. As the co-chairs continue to seek guidance on the way forward, we would like to reiterate that we want to see the submission with draft elements as a clear standalone option in the next iteration of the input document. Thank you.
Thank you. Kuwait.
Thank you, co-chairs, and we appreciate all your efforts being applied and all the hard work being placed in all the work that's being presented. Kuwait, as a member of the Arab group, wish to reinstate that the multi-layered and imbalanced approach in the text that was provided, trying to find common grounds also between the different states on an NCQG alignment has unfortunately been taken away, along with the substance and the purpose from what is required by the G77 and China group. We fully agree with our colleagues from the G77 and China group that we were a bit disappointed to what needs to be acknowledged for moving forward, instead of going into a helpless loophole. We were hoping that the text aligns itself with Article 2 and 9 from the Paris Agreement, mainly agreeing accordingly on applying focus on a constructive quantum and a time frame that could be indicated so we can develop a way forward of achieving the mandate. And hopefully we can see that in the next text modified. Thank you.
Thank you, Kuwait. Iraq.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. We really appreciate your effort in this matter. Iraq aligns with the statement delivered by representatives of G77 and China, Africa Group, LMDC, and Arab Group. We agree with the colleagues who mentioned the text is unbalanced and it need more balance. We think it is imperative to refer to the principles and the provisions of the convention, for example, recalling the Article 4, paragraph 5, 7, 8, and 9, and Article 3, paragraph 5. And these paragraphs should be written in details. We agree with the scale up all international investment, but not in domestics. Also, we believe the NCQG should be taken into the account less science aligned with the Paris objectives. We retreat para 43 concerning no reference to the Biodiversity Convention. We refuse targeting energy, industry, and transportation sectors and emissions in our developing country, as it is outside of the mandate of NCQG. And we refuse the following sub-elements as well: contribution base, contributors, domestic flows, recipients, global investment goal, Article 2.1c, and a goal of achieving net zero 1.5 emission reduced. It is imperative that the streamline and marriage of section multi-dimensional and multi-layer approach. Our option is to embedded section 4, titled with the quantitative and qualitative elements of the goal with the section 6 and 7. This section on quantum should be the core elements in the text, with the refer to the figures to support the mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, technology transfer, capacity building, and involving need and priorities of developing countries. We agree with the principles in paragraph 76, 77, 78, and 79. On access, we support paragraph 68 and 70. We believe that responsibilities of delivering of the NCQG fall on the developing countries as per to convention, and it is in Paris Agreement. Top-down policies and approach, as well as the involvement of non-party stockholder and institution, is outside of the mandate and should be deleted. In particular, approach that target any sector in a manner that impact food and energy security should not be included in the text. It is significant to concentrate on the special circumstances that we recognize are outlined in the Article 4.8 and 4.9 on the Convention. On transparency, we need to modelize more precise to avoid double counting distant climate change from official development assistance. The transparency arrangement must be incorporate the climate finance definition. On equality, we have two higher priorities for equality: our grant-based support and the alignment of support with national plans. The goal must be respond to need of all developing country regions and should be very clear, ensuring equitable distribution of finance. In conclude, our position remains the same. The NCQG shall be 1.1 trillion US dollar from developed country to developing country annually from the period of 2025-2029, not including the arrears of the 100 billion US dollar, at which point the quantum will be renewed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Allow me to align with the statements by the G77 in China and AOSIS, as well as the joint statement just delivered on behalf of AOSIS and the LDCs. Co-chairs, we join others in thanking you for this refined input paper. However, we also join others in expressing disappointment that our AOSIS submission is still not reflected in what we see in front of us. We underline our expectation that our AOSIS submission will be fully taken into account as this process moves forward, as well as our joint submission with the LDCs. There are key principles highlighted in the AOSIS submission that are critical to ensure the NCQG is fit for purpose. These include adequacy, specifically in relation to quantum, balance, and dynamism of needs, as well as the principles of predictability, transparency, access, and complementarity and coherence. The principles reflected in the AOSIS submission aim to operationalize the Paris Agreement, especially in the context of Article 9, which is critical to build from the lessons learned from the USD 100 billion goal, particularly in terms of the lack of precision in targeted finance to SIDS and LDCs, notwithstanding the recognition of their special case. The genesis of this principle is enshrined in the Convention in Article 3, but is further developed and clarified in the Paris Agreement. There is also a history of decisions that have cemented the understandings of special circumstances of SIDS and LDCs. It is therefore good to hear so many colleagues recognize the need to reflect these special circumstances in the NCQG, including in relation to scaled-up provision of financial resources, access, concessionality, debt sustainability, and systemic inequities. In keeping 1.5 alive, it is also critical that the NCQG be designed in every aspect to drive forward the transition away from fossil fuels in this critical decade, including by making it clear that any transaction that contributes to the expansion of fossil fuel supply is not a climate finance transaction. We have an opportunity this year to speak with one voice on the reforms to our international financial architecture that are needed for a climate course correction in all relevant institutions and fora. Finally, for this process to be credible, we have got to bring our finance ministries with us on this journey. I'm already noticing a concerning discrepancy between the enthusiasm for reform I hear in this room and the challenges I hear being emphasized by developed country partners in conversations outside of it. We need those in the driver's seat of these institutions to demonstrate leadership. Otherwise, many of us will continue to be left behind. Finance drives everything else, and we all know this. For the sake of the most vulnerable, we therefore need to see political engagement at the highest levels this year. We came together as a global community in Paris to agree to act on this immense planetary threat, and we need that same level of commitment this year. Como tada, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Saudi Arabia.
Thank you for giving me the floor. We would like to align ourselves with the statement made by the Arab Group, the G77, and the LMDC. Addressing imbalances and dissatisfaction is crucial for fair and equitable progress, and agreeing to disagree on core components like mandate and quantum creates ambiguities that hinder cooperation. As such, we cannot accept this text as a basis for further work as it is imbalanced. We have the following key substantive elements to highlight. The responsibility of delivery of the NCQG falls only on developed countries as per the Convention and its Paris Agreement. All developing countries must be supported by the NCQG as per the Convention. Top-down policies and approaches, as well as the involvement of non-party stakeholders and institutions, is outside of the mandate and should be removed. In particular, approaches that target any sector in a manner that impacts food and energy security should be deleted. Finally, our position remains the same. The NCQG shall be $1.1 trillion from developed countries to developing countries annually from 2025 to 2029, not including the arrears of the $100 billion at which point the quantum will be renewed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. European Union.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thanking the co-chairs for the continuous efforts to advance our work. I mean, we're not happy with the restructuring of the substantive sections of this iteration, but as we understand the document has no status, we're very okay to continue to engage. So I'll start with balance, and we actually note that the text is unbalanced in aspects of the NCQG on broader investment flows that are not articulated as clearly as they need to be. As you already know, inclusion of these broader flows is a top political priority for us, and that may well be something that will be debated for still quite some time to be. There are many things in the text that we disagree with, such as multiple references to the convention, the language used under principles and so on. But we're not asking you to lead those because, as we have understood the NCQG process, at this point we are not taking options off the table. So I want to focus on where we have convergence, and I believe at least there were a number of speakers before me at the previous session who also did that, and I want to continue in that spirit. The European Union supports the assessment by the Environmental Integrity Group on commonalities that go well beyond access and transparency. We also see international public action to be at the core of the goal, and I believe that we are well aligned on access challenges for groups with capacity constraints and also on collective tracking of progress. So on access, we believe that the document can and it should go well beyond what's in the document now. So we agree on the importance of improving access to both multilateral and bilateral finance, and particular attention needs to be given to LDCs and SIDS. We also stress the importance of including in this respect the vulnerable communities and countries, including groups such as women, children, youth, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups. We see access very much as a cross-cutting feature of the NCQG, and note that there are already many initiatives and projects that we can build on. So just to be even a bit more concrete on what are these ways to improving access, so strengthening capacity building efforts and improving absorptive capacities, promoting country ownership, improving and simplifying access to different sources and channels of finance, including harmonization of procedures, increasing coherence and complementarity, and using programmatic approaches. We would have really wanted to discuss together here in Bonn how we can collectively reflect access in the decision type language, but I understand that this is indeed our last session now here, and you know, it will probably not be possible. On transparency arrangements, just to touch on that also very quickly, I think there are loads of commonalities, the importance of the enhanced transparency framework at the center, and use that wherever we can. We also see the role for the Standing Committee on Finance and its final assessment and overview of climate finance flows in tracking progress, building on the long-standing experience of the SCF in collecting, analyzing, and synthesizing data from a range of sources, and also in providing a shared and balanced overview. We also see a clear role for the Article 9.5 submissions in the transparency. We acknowledge and stress that many countries are already contributing to climate finance and want to see increased transparency from all contributors in line with Article 13.9 of the Paris Agreement. This is also a key priority for the European Union to have a clearer picture of the overall climate finance provided and mobilized, and whether it actually answers the needs and priorities of developing countries. Now, transparency for us, it consists of looking backwards to the progress made to achieve the goal. And we note that in the document, there seemed to be a slight confusion on review and transparency. So we see a review of the goal to be something different from transparency, because it's also linked to a time frame. And obviously, we are very happy to discuss the issue of the review, but it's not under transparency. Also want to stress the importance of impact and effectiveness, and that's also something that transparency should capture. Quality of finance, and I assure you this is my last point. So that's a very broad topic on which I believe we have quite divergent views as well, but at least our understanding is that we all agree that quality relates to efficiency and effectiveness, and it's not always directly proportional to the quantity or the concessionality of finance. We've also studied figures of the independent high-level expert group, and now also continue to be open to engaging on those topics with our partners. On principles, this is the very, very final point. We don't see a specific need for a specific section on principles. We see that there are lots of language there that's clearly not needed. But in the interest of time, I'll conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Fiji.
Thank you, co-chairs, Fiona and Zahir, for your hard work and guidance rendered on this process, and for initiating substantive discussions both yesterday and today. Fiji aligns our intervention with the statements made by Argentina on behalf of the Group of 77 in China, Samoa and the Maldives on behalf of AOCs, and Gambia on behalf of LDCs. The input paper, while comprehensive, has significant issues that needs to be addressed. As highlighted by a number of parties, we need to ensure a balanced and effective approach that we can take to Baku. The paper is not sufficiently streamlined, resulting in redundancies and repetitions that dilute the overall intention of the new collective quantified goal. Co-chairs, we feel that there is an inherent bias that overlooks the purpose of the new collective quantified goal to deliver climate finance from developed countries to developing countries as stipulated by the COP and CMA mandates. The paper fails to adequately reference key decision texts from COP27, COP28 concerning loss and damage finance, LDF, as an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the COP and CMA. Although paragraphs 262 mentions that LDF, it lacks sufficient detail and emphasis. Co-chairs on defining a quantum, the input paper is creating confusion and is ambiguous by continuously stating varying figures. Paragraphs 98A, 186, 189, 191, 193, 216 have stated different figures for quantum and needed to be relooked at. Co-chairs for vulnerable countries like seeds, the paper fails to address the special circumstances of small island developing states and list developed countries, LDCs. This oversight is particularly concerning given the increasing urgency of our situation. Ignoring the dire calls from our countries on the brink of losing our statehood due to rising sea levels showcases a disturbing lack of empathy and moral responsibility. We have the moral authority on climate change, and developed countries have the moral responsibility to keep their promises in the Paris Agreement. There is no plan B. Evidence at hand shows that between 2016 and 2020, seeds have paid in debt service 18 times more than we received as climate finance, comparing 26 billion versus US $1.5 billion for climate adaptation. In Fiji, public debt stands at 83.2%, which is still 30% higher than pre-COVID levels. Our debt to GDP ratios are generally deteriorating due in part to the cost of debt servicing exceeding seeds GDP growth rates. Poor credit ratings and close to distress levels of indebtedness are making any additional borrowing to cover climate adaptation and mitigation needs impossible. Co-chairs, from 2021, seeds together received only 3% of global climate finance. The Pacific receives only 0.22% of this climate finance, which is approximately 5% of our actual needs. It is not even a drop in the ocean surrounding our communities, the waters that threatens our very existence. To negotiate the urgency of our survival begins to feel futile. Please allow me to share our experiences from tropical cyclones Yasa and Ana in 2021. This tropical cyclone swept through our islands in the midst of COVID-19. Before this, we had the first Category 5 tropical cyclone to landfall in the southern hemisphere. Tropical Cyclone Winston hit us very badly in 2016. One after the other, and a year after this severe tropical cyclone Harold hit our islands again. Our economy, already ailing from the shock of the pandemic, was further devastated by the cyclones. Of total damages, we received only about 12% of humanitarian support. To this day, some 4 years later, we are still recovering. But co-chairs, we are resilient, and because we must be, we offered a solution through the AOSIS submission. We reiterate the key recommendations and elements from the AOSIS submissions, which needs to be reflected in the input paper. Substantive and procedural attributes to clarify what counts towards the goal, including disaggregated information on finance for seeds and LDCs, and enhanced access measures. We do not want to see anything outside the mandate or anything that intends to reopen the convention, nor the Paris Agreement. We are not here to renegotiate the Paris Agreement, particularly its principles. Finally, co-chairs, reflecting on the intervention by Canada yesterday to start drafting some text, we feel that it is too early and we should not rush ourselves until we can have a workable text whereby every party can work together towards Baku. Co-chairs, we thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiji. Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you, Co-Chair, for this new version of the text. Nigeria aligns itself with the perspective of Argentina on behalf of G77 and China, and Egypt on behalf of AGN. We look forward for sustaining the principles of the Convention and Paris Agreement, especially as it relates to Article 2.1c and Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. Our journey toward a low-carbon, resilient economy is of paramount concern to us, and we will appreciate pathways that consider the legitimate right of developing countries to sustainable development. The delivery of NCQG should ensure a balance between mitigation and adaptation, support nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, and lead to a net economic benefit to developing countries, taking into account their fiscal constraints and challenging microeconomic circumstances. Finally, we will welcome a more robust and balanced test as we move forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Nigeria. Next, Morocco.
Thank you, Co-Chair. As Morocco, we align ourselves with the statements made by G77 and China, the African group, and the Arab group. Morocco would like to thank the co-chairs and the secretariats for their continued efforts. And also, we were pleased to see that some of Morocco core textual inputs continue to be reflected in the text. You have asked us to reflect on commonalities in terms of principle. For us, the problem is that we already have many commonalities in agreed principles under the Convention and under the Paris Agreements. But unfortunately, we appear to be forgetting these common principles. Two principles upon which we can all agree are the principle of ambition in light of urgency and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. In light of these principles, the present text is not balanced. Many pages of this text, as it stands, are not about a goal of climate finance from developed country to developing countries. There are many paragraphs about enabling environment and global investment targets, which make all parties contributor to the new goal. Co-Chair, this is unfortunately a sad reflection of efforts we are seeing across the negotiation by certain actors to undermine the principle of differentiation between developed and developing countries, to undermine the principle of equity and justice. It is contrary to the principle of the Paris Agreement. Developing countries are already spending too much money to address climate change challenges we didn't create. We, African countries, are already spending a significant percentage of our GDP every year to address climate challenges. Recently, Morocco, a lower middle-income country, already spending large amounts on its development challenges, spent over $1 billion in 1 year to cope with devastating loss and damage from one single drought. Without greater climate finance ambition from developed countries, we will not achieve the Paris Agreement. The measures of climate finance ambition by developed countries will be the quantum of their provision and mobilization under the NCQG. At its essence, the NCQG is a specific quantum. The core mandate is to establish a new collective quantified goal for mobilization of climate finance to developing countries by developed countries. We came to Bonn to help agree on this quantum, but so far, all the discussions have been qualitative, not quantitative. Unfortunately, we basically have not advanced on agreeing on a quantum since Glasgow. We must have a quantum for mobilization with a quantitative goal for provision and quantified sub-goal for finance for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. In line with the principle of adequacy, to NCQG shouldn't be a static goal, but a dynamic goal, revisited on 5 years time frame to synchronize with the global stocktake and NDC time frame based on up-to-date and high-quality information. In this vein, regarding the principle of transparency and predictability, we also must learn from developed country failure to deliver the $100 billion by 2020 and the failure to institute adequate transparency measures around it. We must equip these new NCQG with transparency elements to ensure that developed countries remain accountable for their commitment of climate finance. Unfortunately, the current transparency elements in the draft text are disjoint and are not fit for purpose. We should draw from the existing transparency arrangements of the Paris Agreement, including the enhanced transparency framework and any strengthening of its guidelines, the biannual transparency reports, forward-looking communication as included in Article 9.5, the ex-post reporting as included in Article 9.7, and any other relevant reporting source from developed countries under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. We also call for yearly updates from developed countries, as called for yesterday by my colleague from Samoa on behalf of the OASIS. We must not repeat mistakes of the past. We must use information available to track progress on delivering equitable climate finance that is additional to the development finance. We invite all colleagues to move away from conceptual idea and start focusing on quantum based on principle on common but differentiated responsibility reflecting on urgency. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Thank you. India.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I am speaking on behalf of India in its national capacity. India aligns with the statement of G77 China, LMDC, the African Group, China, Cuba, and Arab Group. Before I comment on elements of the input paper, I would like to set the context in which the NCQG discussion should be carried out. The GDP that developed countries have today is basically on account of high emissions in the past. Today, the developed countries continue to proceed on similar path, not having achieved the necessary reduction in emissions and keeping an ambition which is highly inconsistent with the requisite climate action. While the developing countries face the consequence of historical emissions to which they have not contributed, they have to undertake adaptation measures to deal with the negative impacts of climate change, face loss and damages, and on the top of that are expected to undertake mitigation measures, while most of the carbon budget has already been consumed by the developed countries. It is high time that developed countries realize their responsibilities in the line with Article 9 of Paris Agreement and contribute in supporting developing countries for their ambitious mitigation and adaptation actions, including loss and damage on account of adverse climate impacts. Our discussions on NCQG should be carried out in this context. Co-Chair, I would like to speak about the elements of input papers. We appreciate the effort made in this input paper. However, the input paper is highly imbalanced, as has been suggested by colleagues from developing countries. We share their concerns on the long section on multi-layered and multi-dimensional goal, which carries content reflected in other sections. This is inappropriate as we must discuss options on access, transparency, and others in respective sections. For instance, we must discuss the time frame in specific section titled time frame and not as part of section on multidimensional and multi-layered goal. If need be, the options from multi-layered, multi-dimensional goal that relate to time frame, for instance, could be shifted to the time frame section itself. We are certain that discussions could benefit from a more balanced input paper, and so we mandate the co-chairs to restructure the current version input paper by retraining language on critical elements such as principles contained in para 77 and 78, para number 189 that calls for a quantum of over $1 trillion per year, Para 48, identifying the scale and needs of the developing countries. Para 230, 232, to put in place arrangements on burden sharing. Para 420 and 421 on climate finance definition. Further, we express our serious concern on multiple mention of matters that are plainly outside the mandate. For instance, there are references to areas that we believe are beyond the scope of UNFCCC framework. With respect to contributor base, Article 9 clearly specifies who all need to contribute to the goal. There is no necessity for the mention of a contributor base. With respect to recipient base, again, the COP21 decision specifies that the goal has to take care of needs of developing countries. Discussion on the recipient base is uncalled for. With respect to outcome-based goal, any mention of outcome-based NCQG cannot be there, as only outcome we can trace is whether the developed countries' commitments are proportionate to the need of developing countries. With respect to the section on policy incentives, this is not acceptable at all. We do not support any top-down, one-size-fits-all approach. Policies for a country are sovereign matters, and certain categories of policies should not be set as a condition for climate finance. With respect to global investment goal, portraying NCQG as an investment goal is not what the COP21 decided on. It has to be a climate finance goal. It is amply clear that developed countries have contributed disproportionately to the carbon stock, and they need to put on table ambitious proposals for public funds to support the climate action of developing countries. In respect of international financial architecture, any discussion on international financial architecture is also outside the scope of convention, an agreement for simple reason that financial architecture is a much broader area for discussion in this forum with its own nuances and complexities, and thus should be left to the appropriate bodies. Lastly, India wants to reiterate that we need an input paper which is talking about the objectives of these discussions, which is to set the new collective quantifiable goal that can be achieved in time if we stick to the mandate. Thank you, co-chairs.
Thank you. Oman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We fully support the statements made by G77, the Arab Group, LMDC, Kuwait, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And we would like to emphasize on the following as well. The NCQG should be set in accordance with the principles and provisions of the Convention and based on the needs and priorities of developing countries. And the delivery should ensure balance between mitigation, adaptation, and support NDCs and NAPs as well. In addition, we would like to comment on specific paras in the input paper, especially paragraph 123C, as we don't see any link between NCQG and commitments of removing fossil fuel subsidy. Para 167, on reducing investment on fossil fuel, we see that NCQG is not the right place to discuss this topic, and it will have a major impact on energy sector and affordability. Para 293, we would like to emphasize on the obligations of the developed countries to support developing countries as per the convention. Finally, we would like to request deletion of para 123C, 167, 293, and any text related to energy sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Armenia.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And Armenia says that the establishment of the global climate finance goal is a crucial process that must incorporate several critical considerations. It is essential to ensure that the goal is robust, evidence-based, and provides the necessary guidance for further implementation at different levels. This framework should specifically cater to the needs of developing countries, ensuring equitable distribution and effective utilization of resources to support their climate adaptation and mitigation efforts and to address the loss and damage. Additionally, we believe that the following key elements should be maintained or strengthened in the NCQG to make the goal practical, operational, and guiding. We need a proper analysis of unmet goals. The previous quantitative goal, which aimed at an annual climate finance flow of 100 billion, regrettably remains unmet. Therefore, it is imperative to conduct a thorough analysis to understand the underlying reasons for the shortfall. The segregation of new quantitative goal is also important. We need to break down the NCQG into specific mitigation and adaptation subcomponents, and it is gratifying to see such elements in the draft. We also believe that wherever feasible, these efforts could be further detailed at sector levels to assist countries in identifying and establishing their own specific mitigation and adaptation finance targets. When it comes to climate finance taxonomies, it is equally important that all countries which are potential recipients of climate finance have introduced comprehensive national climate finance taxonomies. These taxonomies should aim to clearly define eligible sectors and subsectors, ensuring their alignment with the national targets under LEDS, NDC, and NEP frameworks. And we would like to see this notion properly reflected in the text. Also, we believe that for efficiency of the NCQG, the different mechanisms could be embraced to meet climate finance goals. For instance, debt for climate swaps hold significant potential in this regard to channel financial resources towards financing mitigation and adaptation projects in least developed and developing countries. International climate finance architecture should be streamlined to enable direct access for developing countries to the available funds. To achieve this, the primary focus should be on advancing the engagement of national financiers, including banks, non-banking financial institutions, and pension funds in the process. When it comes to the terms and categories reflected in the NCQG, we believe that in the text, and we hope that in the next iteration of the text, these terms and categories could be squarely aligned with the Convention and the Paris Agreement. This refers to paragraphs 1 to 3b and 357, which contain new categories of states which are not defined in the Convention and the Paris Agreement. Our main concern here is that the introduction of new categories of states to be prioritized in terms of climate financing could open the door for expanding the list, which may result in compartmentalization of the global climate finance goal and its availability to fewer developing countries in contravention of the Paris Agreement. Based on these considerations, we suggest to list only those categories of countries and states particularly vulnerable to climate change, which are reflected in the Paris Agreement. And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Armenia. Just for your own stock take, we've been through 14 interventions and we're already at 4 o'clock. I have 16 more interventions to come. So just be cautious about the time. We'd like to also use some time at the end to actually respond to what many of you asked us in terms of the way forward. So colleagues, I have next on my list, Australia.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I really appreciate the work that you've done on this product. It's far easier to read and to follow the options that have been put forward by parties, noting, of course, the additional options that have come forward in submissions in the last week. I also appreciate the larger space. Inclusivity in this process is important, and I note the importance of allowing space for observers and, of course, those who need translators, because it's important that everyone can follow along, and access to these discussions is important. In my last intervention on Saturday, I said that I hoped we would be able to move discussions forwards to areas of commonality. I've been really disappointed. We don't have much time left, and I'm disappointed that all I've done in the last 2 sessions is listen to people seeking deletion of paragraphs, who commented only on concerns they had with the paper, or yesterday engaged in a game of word count to measure balance. We also have concerns with the paper, but honestly, colleagues, this is the product we asked our co-chairs to build. It's a paper which represents inputs from parties, and it shows how far apart we are. Frankly, it shows how much we do disagree. We're not going to land an outcome at Baku if we engage in a game of striking out each other's text, or bracket attack, or positional mandate tug of war. We need to build this together, and from the ground up, engage with each other's ideas and find areas of commonalities and common purpose around which to build the Christmas tree. And it's for this reason I disagree with statements made by others who said we need to start with the quantum. The quantum is the star on top of the Christmas tree. We need to do all of the work we can to build out towards it. In fact, The decision at COP28 makes that really clear. It speaks to interlinkages and the fact that the quantum is dependent on the structure. It's also dependent on the types of sources and instruments, the time frame, the breadth of the contributor base, and the channels of financing included. So let's talk about those things. So I'm really grateful for those who have engaged with commonalities. I encourage those who speak after me to engage with commonalities, and let's talk to each other. Let's engage on ideas. And so I'm going to do the same. Here are the areas I see as commonalities, and I'm heartened to reflect that I've actually heard other people speak to these same ones as well. On transparency, we see general agreement that the basis for transparency arrangements will be built around the Paris Agreement transparency architecture. The ETF should be a basis for bedrock for reporting. So many of us, I've heard LDCs, AOSIS, Canada, Norway, ILAC, and the EU note that we may need to update the ETF, either in 2028 or earlier. It's not clear to me if we have the same agreement as to what it is we need to update the ETF with, but we know we need to make it fit for purpose for the goal that we design. I agree with others that say that the SEF has a role to play in the context of the compilation of data. I think that's an area of commonality and tracking of progress, therefore. I think there is need for us to think about how the new goal and tracking towards it is integrated into the existing products of the SEF, including the biennial assessment. I don't think we have agreement as to whether or not we need a separate report or if the biennial assessment can serve as that report, but I think we know that we need to see the new goal integrated into the work of the SEF. On impact and effectiveness, I see multiple areas of agreement. I see agreement on the need for consideration of gender responsiveness, Indigenous peoples and local communities, children and youth, calibrating the entire goal to ensure that it is integrated throughout. This is a cross-cutting element, but particularly should be considered with respect to access. I hear agreement that we need to learn lessons from the $100 billion goal, which I'll affirm the OECD has confirmed was met in 2022. We know the $100 billion goal was not a vehicle for transformational impact. In fact, it was often discussed in a vacuum. I see agreement on the need to speak to the broader context, financial realities and global financial ecosystem. In this context, speaking to the challenges that countries face in the financial landscape is critical. So unsustainable debt, cost of capital and other disenablers I think I hear common agreement upon. I see agreement on the need to deliver impact, support and deliver meaningful mitigation action, and thus the ambition elements and urgency of climate action elements in the paper represent important areas of commonality. And finally, of course, to access. I support many of the comments that were made by my colleague from New Zealand yesterday with respect to access, as well as colleagues from ILAC, LDCs, Nepal, and AOSIS, and today again from the joint submission from SIDS and LDCs. We see this as a growing area of commonality, an area of text that can be strengthened based on the inputs that are already there. I know we need to think about access in a multi-layered approach, and I'm using that terminology differently, not just under a subheading for access, but we must consider how the entire goal enables access, another cross-cutting and holistic element. I agree with others that we need a more transformed product going into our third meeting, one which helps us understand the relationship between all of these elements. So please give us less text, but not less substance. Give us something smart, something that will help us to engage with each other and engage with each other's ideas rather than disagree over balance or mandate. And I'm sure you'll do this, but we would also appreciate a synthesis of submissions so that everyone's proposals can be presented holistically as distinct proposals. As you've been doing, I also encourage continued opportunities for consultation with you both as you're developing the product and after you've developed it, and hoping that you will have that released well in advance of the third meeting so that parties have the time to digest and prepare. So thank you again, co-chairs, for your patience with us and for your continued efforts to get us to talk to each other.
Thank you. Barbados.
Thank you so much, co-chair. And we really want to recognize the efforts of the co-chairs and the secretariat in the text that you've been able to provide for us, as well as the guidance that you've been seeking to give. We wish to specifically align ourselves with the statements today from AOSIS and LDCs jointly, and to stress the need for our very specific and special needs and circumstances to be recognized in this process. We're identified as such, and we need that to be very clear. We need also to address the systemic inequalities we face, including high cost of capital, high transaction costs, capacity constraints, and the bandying about of assumptions and comments on corruption. There's a need for financing for LDCs and SIDS to be based in grant and highly concessional public monies. On another track, let us keep in view the fact that we need to move the NCQG process forward in light of the fact that it is also influencing discussions in other rooms. We've had all sorts of imaginary farm animals promised. We've had cakes. We now have trees with various branches and stars. And it is time that we get down to a more serious business. There are assumptions that are being made by organizations outside of this space relative to what they believe is a decision already made on a multi-layered approach. It is making the lives of some developing countries, especially SIDS and LDCs, exceedingly difficult, especially when it is grouped with further assumptions about Article 2.1c, whose dialogue only starts tomorrow. We need to be cognizant of the above, and we need, therefore, to move with a certain amount of a clarity that we have not shown so far in this process. I am pleading with parties in the room to let us move to substantive matters and to move this process forward before more and more SIDS and LDCs simply disappear from this gathering because we disappear from this planet. Thank you.
Thank you. China.
Thank you, Co-Chair, for your hard work and the dedication. I like your scarf, Fiona. Is that gift from Zahia? Or you share the affection of love of color? As I share our view to this document yesterday, and understand that there won't be a new iteration for the text from you until maybe September, October. So I will just share my thoughts with you and my colleagues in and outside of the room. First, let me reflect some developed countries' comments. Some share disappointment for the slow process. Let's keep in mind at this moment, none of the developed country parties have provided any quantum to us and adhere Convention and the Paris Agreement. How can this process can be fast? Over the past 200 years, developed country parties have sacrificed the Earth's environment to become developed countries. But 200 years later, you undermine the free market economy you endorse by imposing a high tariff on new energy products from developing countries, hinder the planet's recovery. 30 years ago, developed countries parties committed financial support to help developing countries addressing climate change, asking us to join the convention and agree to Article 4 of the convention. But 30 years later, you propose that developed country parties can contribute voluntarily while redefining yourself, the wealthy one, as recipients. 15 years ago, in Copenhagen, The other side pledged to mobilize 100 billion annually in a new and additional funds to developing countries. But 15 years later, you proudly represent a problematic report full of loans that increase the burden on developing countries and repackage existing bilateral aids as part of fulfilling commitments. 10 years ago, you agreed to Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, reaffirming your financial responsibility and expressing your willingness to continue contribute. But 10 years later, you selectively highlight Article 9.3, Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, attempting to invade your obligation through carefully choosing provisions. In the past few days, we have felt that we are not engaging with the honest and committed developing countries. Instead, we have been dealing with few insincere and self-serving nations that have no intention of honoring international treaties. Please stop claiming that you care about 1.5 targets and prioritize mitigation and adaptation. Your action acknowledging commitment yet failing to fulfill them, refusing to pay the loss and damage you've caused, and expecting victims to bear the burden. Frankly, I'm reluctant to urge you to uphold Convention and its Paris Agreement because you seem eager to discard them, feeling no obligations, but rather pride in doing so. However, I must distinguish among developed countries. According to ODI, some developed countries, including Norway, France, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, happy birthday, Gabby, Luxembourg, and Netherlands, exercised their fair share of supporting developing countries in 2021. My previous remarks is not for you, as you gave the world hope. We, the developing countries, have not only paid trillions for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, but also voluntarily support each other beyond our capacity. As China, our domestic climate finance mobilization was greater than that all developed countries combined, account for 51% of all domestic climate finance globally. But we, the developing country, have no intention to make your number look good or be part of your responsibility, as we are doing all we can do to save the world, to save our home. Let's adhere the principle and provision of the Convention and its Paris Agreement. Bring hope to the world. I thank you.
Thank you, China. Japan.
Thank you, co-chairs. Let me appreciate your dedicated work as always. But at this stage, we share the concern about the shortage of time. Only less than 6 months left to decide NCQG, and our discussion speed is not fast enough to reach the conclusion by them. I would like to recall that we really need to reach our common agreement in NCQG, which will help us achieve the fit-for-purpose goal of the Paris Agreement. For that, we need to discuss about how to mobilize all sources to match the needs of developing countries. We share the urgency of the ambition to scale up financing, and we see commonalities around the intention to improve their limited access, which should be resolved. That was part of our goal forward for us. There also is an emergence of some consensus about transparency, but we still have certain divergence about the context of transparency. Hence, need to deepen our discussion and share our understanding how best to use possible sources of information in order to improve transparency. We understand there's many options that we still have divergence, but we would like to encourage co-chairs to continue to work on this document with which we have been discussed so far, but a revised version, much shorter, not losing substance to actually could get into the substantive discussion, and also useful for high-level ministerial dialogue in the near future. To do so, we always welcome continued consultation opportunities with co-chairs as you are developing the document. We should move forward to the substantive discussion positively and constructively, and we trust co-chairs to find and guide us the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Japan. Bangladesh.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, colleagues. In the beginning, let me associate myself with the G77 China and the Gambia on behalf of LDC, and latest our joint statement of LDC and AOCs. In fact, I want to highlight some of the important issues, particularly on quality. Actually, quality, quantity, transparency, and accountability, everything is important. As LDC, although we are not bound to submit NDC, but we submitted our ambitious NDC, we submitted NAVs, and to go up to well below 2 degrees centigrade, I think NCQG is very important for all of us, particularly for the climate vulnerable LDC and seeds. Regarding quality, actually, I would like to highlight some of the important points. It should be based on Article 9, particularly Article 9.4 and 9.5 of the Paris Agreement, and Article 11 of the Convention. And I think to ensure the quality, the definition of climate finance is very important, and uphold the criteria of new addition and to avoid the duplication. And as vulnerable country, we are always in favor of grant-based adaptation financing. As you know, the recent reports on Oxfam that maximum funding, around 59% adaptation financing is grant, and out of that maximum financing is market-based. So market-based adaptation loan should not be treated as climate finance. So grant-based adaptation financing and balanced allocation between adaptation mitigation and loss and damage is very important for us. And globally, all over the globally, covering all the windows, the adaptation financing is the 7.92%. It is not balanced at all. Some of the parties, including Japan, Australia, others, said the access of climate finance is very important, particularly on adaptation financing. If we treat the example of Green Climate Fund, we see the adaptation finance, timing of adaptation is more than double from the mitigation financing. We are saying about direct access, but if you see the direct access particularly applicable for the GCF, Adaptation Fund, these two funds. But the financing flow from the UN approvals window on Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund is the 1 to 2%. If the money flow is like that, 1 to 2% to the UN approvals windows, then what is the benefit of the direct access of funding? So significant finance from the NCQG should flow from the UN approvals windows to get the balanced allocation, to get the quality funding, both for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. And another important issue, I think, on accounting perspective, we actually depend on, or particularly depend on, the OECD accounting. I think the accounting is another important issue, and it should be the responsibility should be laid on the SCF or the UN Absolute Secretariat to make the BTR to make the climate financing accounting in a transparent manner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Bangladesh. Zambia.
Thank you so much, co-chairs, and thank you for the hard work to bring us to where we are, and for the text that you gave us.
my statement is aligned with what was said yesterday by Egypt on behalf of the AGN and also the G77 and China. I think at the onset, it is important for us to have the context of the NCQG set in the right way. There is a history to this process, and the history is in the convention, is in the Paris Agreement. There are various articles that gives us a basis for our discussions. There are ambitions which have been spelled out in the NDCs, in the NAPs. There is the 1.5 degrees target or goal, which is scientifically established. We have issues around the just transition and the needs which have been spelled out before. So this gives us the context. We have had discussions in the GST as well regarding the upcoming commitments. Just refer to paragraph 28 of the GST text, I think so, to tell us in terms of what is that we are advancing in order for us to make this world a safe place. So that context needs to be highlighted or at least spelled out very clearly from the various elements that are in the text. That's at the top. The second part is obviously the issue of the quantum. And as African group, we have been upfront, and we have spelled it out that 1.3 trillion will be an ideal figure to work with. Of course, we can discuss, but we have the needs assessments which have been done before with higher numbers, but this is what we'd like to work with. And the third aspect is about the time frame. And again, we are suggesting these things in order for us to have elements clearly spelled out to guide us in the way that we should structure our work and in the way that we see the next text to highlight. The issue of instruments is also very important. We need to know how will this quantum be delivered, what instruments will be used. We know that they have been spelled out in the text that we have, but again, the organization within that will be important. There are also delivery channels, and this is important because we have the financial mechanism. We have the operating entities under the convention, under the financial mechanism which have been established, including the more recent fund for loss and damage. So these are not new, but we can spell them out as institutions that will help us to monitor. And when we talk about transparency, we know that we can receive reports from the GCF, from the GEF, from the adaptation fund. We can receive reports from the fund for loss and damage. So that is clearly a place where we all meet and we can sort of achieve the accountability mechanism. Access modalities are an important issue, and finally at the end is about sources. We need to understand that there's a role for public finance in what we are talking about. And finally, co-chairs, I would like to mention that the next enhancements of the NDC, and I'm sure we expect that the emerging economies will play a significant role. The eyes will be on what these emerging economies are planning in as far as reducing emissions. So those are the focus, or will be the focus in the enhancement process. So my question is, if they don't have resources, how are we going to achieve that enhancement? How is the implementation going to be done? And so I think in the statements that we hear sometimes, are of concern. because we expect ambition from a certain group of nations, but then we don't expect them to have the resources. So you can't have it both ways. So one has to give up, and the question is which one? And so it is important that there is no, we don't begin to separate players, because we all need to play a part. And again, the impacts of climate change have no respecter of a nation, and that we know. Every country is at risk, and we know that even those countries that we never expected to have particular severe impacts have had those consequences of climate change affect them. And what has been left behind is the severe impact on the economic development trajectories, the impacts on the communities, impacts on ecosystems, and so on and so forth. And so we should not discriminate in short as to who should be provided the resources and who is more vulnerable and who is not. Thank you.
Thank you, Zambia. Bolivia. Kenya.
Thank you, Co-Chair, for the floor. Kenya aligns with the views made by the Africa Group and the G77. We thank you for this text, but we believe that still needs to be done. We are concerned, as mentioned by many group of the 77 members, of the imbalanced nature of the text. As mentioned by the Africa Group yesterday, the text incorporates elements that are not within the mandates and responsibilities of the Convention and its Paris Agreement. Colleagues, we are in unpromising reality where ideas not based on the Convention and its Paris Agreement, such as multi-layered approach, domestic resources in developing countries, amongst others, are taking center stage even in this text. The question is, are we really taking into account needs, realities, and circumstances of developing countries? We are extremely concerned that the text does not clearly present the quantum options put forward by developing countries. This process has continually asked for ambition. Developing countries have prepared 2 cycles of NDCs, have prepared NAPs, and NAPs are national adaptation plans. Yet finance is not supporting the much-needed implementation at the required scale and in terms that respond to realities of developing countries. We had an expectation that the SB session here would see developed countries put forward some quantum options that we could engage on. It has not been so, even after having 10 expert dialogues. Developing country groups are the only ones presenting quantum options, as finance is needed to support climate actions. However, these quantum options are still not optimally represented in the text. We do not want to relive another USD 100 billion per year goal experience. That goal was not arrived at in a participatory manner and did not take into account needs. And that's why we have the NCQG process. Kenya views that we should avoid this at all costs. We urge you, co-chairs, to have standalone quantum options, not merged ones, like the ones we've seen in the text, but standalone in standalone quantum sections. Our goal is a publicly mobilized finance goal by developed countries to developing countries of $1.3 trillion per year by 2030. Engaging on substantive issues, co-chairs, on principles, Kenya expects a principle-based finance goal. We are here because of the Convention and its Paris Agreement, and therefore the principles and responsibilities therein apply in the NCQG. A standalone section recalling principles of the Convention and Article 2.2 in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication is required. Co-chairs, we are seeking for equity, fairness, and support to implement our climate actions, support our adaptation, loss and damage, just transitions, and mitigation needs. Without that finance, we are not able to implement climate actions in our national plans. We appreciate the inclusion of para 46 of the text, And we look forward to maintaining and further operationalizing this, including acknowledging Articles 4, Para 1E of the Convention, Decision 1 CP 27, paragraphs 29 and 37, and 1 CMA 4, paragraphs 48 and 58 that recognize the special needs and circumstances of African states. Kenya and African states exist in extremely dire and special circumstances. We acknowledge the extreme climate impacts we live in and their frequency, and the fiscal space which is extremely constrained due to our external debt servicing burden. Co-chairs, our African states therefore appreciate that we have special circumstances acknowledged in the Convention and its Paris Agreement, and access to public finance in grants and concessional terms should be assured, both for adaptation and loss and damage. On transparency, as mentioned by the Africa Group, we do not want to repeat the 100 billion mistakes. The enhanced transparency framework is important in building trust and facilitating transparent accounting and reporting of the NCQG. Yes, we do see a role of Article 9.5 communications as long as these are reviewed or are taken through a review process. We also see a role of enhancing the key element of what the Secretariat can do in conducting syntheses of the BTRs on support elements to demonstrate the extent to which support has been delivered. We also acknowledge that we must start reporting on the grant equivalence of finance provided to developing countries, as market rate loans do not count as climate finance. We believe that the text can be streamlined. However, this should produce a balanced text, and that the further redundancies have to be taken account of. We see that we have to go back to our approach. There are key elements. These are quantum, qualitative elements, access, and transparency. Lastly, co-chairs, our understanding of commonalities is one framed within the purview of the Convention and its Paris Agreement and the mandates therein. And therefore, there is indeed convergence on international public finance, but this is definitely under Article 9.1, which triggers mobilization, need for grant-based resources for adaptation, concerns on these enablers, such as unilateral measures, not limiting fiscal space through debt financing for climate, enhanced access for all developing countries through simplified access procedures and reduced conditionalities, and the importance of building trust through the ETF. Finally, the Convention and Paris Agreement speak to sustainable development and poverty eradication, and these are the realities of African states that have to be taken into account. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you. United Kingdom.
Thank you, co-chairs, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm just noting the time and noting that we have been asked by, personally by observers, to ensure that there is time to hear them. I just wanted to make that clear that that request has been made of us, and hopefully we can accommodate it. Co-chairs, we're here to try and hold delegate balance. We're trying to hold all these voices together, and we are trying to find a way through, but I'll just quote one of our colleagues who says that the NCQG cannot be everything to everyone. And, you know, we've agreed with that for a long time, but I wanted to say that we have to make sure that it speaks to everyone here. It does need to have something for each person here. It can't be everything for everyone, but it needs to be something for each of us. So we've heard a lot today, and we're going to carry on hearing a lot. We've got a text that we've worked on for the past few days, and it's better than it was. It's not as good as it needs to be. And is this process going to get us in this form to where we need to be by the end of COP in Baku? So I wanted to say that I wanted to take your steer that we want to focus on the commonalities. There are commonalities here on the importance of the critical decade that we're in, 39 to 44. There's commonality on the importance of the multilateral climate funds, on financial instruments, as the colleague from Zambia mentioned, on how they're channeled, on how debt sustainability is affecting countries, on transaction costs, on capacity constraints, on, as it was put in the submission, the assumption of corruption that I think we shouldn't
accept as a way of functioning. The importance of the GST, new and enhanced NDCs, we can go on. So there's a good basis for commonality, but we are not in a process that will help us get to a final text. So I just wanted to speak about one more thing, which you might have heard me previously talk about, which is the mandate we're under. I would really appreciate in our streamlining that we are clear that we are here in accordance with Article 9.3. We have 1 CP21, para 53, that says that in accordance with 9.3, parties to the Paris Agreement shall set a new collective quantified goal. So then we look at Article 9.3, and we see that as part of a global effort, we must take the lead, developed country parties must take the lead in mobilizing climate finance from a wide variety of sources, instruments and channels, noting the significant role of public funds through a variety of actions, and we must take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. I don't think that I recognize the statements made about things being out of this mandate or outside of this mandate. So I just want to be, I think we have a long way to go. We need to keep some guiding stars. Those two things, those two paragraphs need to be in our minds as we move forward. So that was one thing. And then the last is to, I think I'm going to go back to my colleague from Barbados who called for clarity and a move to substance. And I think that's a good way of keeping our delicate balance. And also noting his point on the NCQG impacting other rooms. And I just wanted to expand on that. It's not just rooms in this UNFCCC, but elsewhere. And so, especially on some of these issues we're talking about where the UNFCCC cannot mandate, we do need to think about how we are speaking to other fora. So once again, I wanted to emphasize our thanks to the co-chairs, fantastic work that they're doing. We think that the next step will need to be a new text with clear options, and that we will need that for the next ad hoc work program. We can then talk about those options, but we need to narrow those down to 3, 5, a number of options, a handleable, if that's a word, handleable number of options on each of these elements. So we can start talking about specific options, specific ways of dealing with each of the challenges that face us, and we will be able to articulate them and talk through them and move on. So we have the ad hoc work program, we will have ministerial dialogue after that, and we will have a route through to COP to land this, I don't want to call it a plane, but land this decision. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, UK. Singapore.
Thank you, co-chairs. My delegation would like to align ourselves with the statements made by the G77 China and by AOSIS. Colleagues, transparency is the bedrock of the Paris Agreement and should also be the bedrock of the NCQG. This is why our delegation would like to echo earlier interventions made on the importance of transparency. We would like to reiterate the AOSIS proposal for annual progress reports to be prepared by the UNFCCC Secretariat. Just before the start of the current SB session, the OECD issued a report stating that the 100 billion goal was reached in 2022. I will not go into the details of our delegation's views on the report here. While we appreciate the efforts by the OECD in preparing its annual report on the progress towards the 100 billion goal, it will be more appropriate for this vital role to be carried out annually within the UNFCCC instead. In this regard, the NCQG should provide guidance on the quality and the consistency of climate finance reporting by developed countries so that everyone would have a clearer picture of what is and what is not happening on the ground. Only with such clarity of the progress and the shortcomings can other stakeholders play their part in a more impactful way. Now, colleagues, there have been many interventions in Cartagena as well as the current session on the mandate of the NCQG, which has implications on which elements should be in the NCQG text. It is clear to our delegation that the principles of the Convention and the Paris Agreement apply to the NCQG. First, the decision to set an NCQG was adopted under the COP, under paragraph 53 of Decision 1 CP21. Now, second, on the relationship between the Convention and the Paris Agreement, which has been discussed here, as well as across several thematic negotiations at the current SB session, we have heard arguments that the Paris Agreement is an independent agreement separate from the Convention. In our view, they are intricately linked, as the Paris Agreement serves to enhance the implementation of the Convention pursuant to Article 2.1 of the Paris Agreement. More specifically to the issue at hand, Article 9.1 reminds us that the provision of the financial resources by developed countries is a continuation of their existing obligations under the Convention. It is also useful to recall that we all agreed to adopt the Paris Agreement under the Convention, as clearly stated in Para 1 of Decision 1 CP21. We hope that helps in providing some clarity. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, just keep an eye on the clock, and you would want us to tell you about the next steps. So please just check the time. Next, I have Ecuador.
Thank you, co-chairs. My delegation aligns with the remarks delivered by the G77, the LMDC, and Group Sur. We thank you for your efforts in this process, but as others, we believe that the current document remains unbalanced and continues to have elements outside of the mandate. We restate that the document should be centered on setting a quantified goal to be delivered from developed countries to address the needs of developing countries. We have mentioned before that the NCQG should be broad enough to address climate change vulnerabilities of all developing countries from all regions, including the specific challenges of middle-income countries, which face limited access to resources, high levels of indebtedness, and limited fiscal space, requiring international support and solidarity. We therefore would appreciate that the co-facilitators captures the reference of the specific challenges of middle-income countries in the input paper. Co-chairs, to make progress, we need to focus on quantum and time frame. As in this meeting, we have not really heard proposals on the quantum by developed countries, and in the input paper references of quantum are on the amounts of trillions of dollars to be delivered by developed countries to developing countries, we would take it then that we may be having a general understanding on this specific element, so that the quantum on the draft decision to be produced is captured in the amounts of trillions of dollars. Thank you very much, co-chairs.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the speakers list. We did receive requests from flags who want to take the floor for a second time. We'll give you the floor on condition you keep it brief. We will stop you if you do not keep it brief, because we want to finish on time. We need to give observers the opportunity, and you want to hear from us on the next steps. So next I have Egypt.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I'll try to be very brief, following on the first intervention, and also colleagues from most of not all developing countries. Quickly, Chair, and we heard a lot of preaching from some colleagues on how to be active and develop and engage. Chair, we have a mandate. The mandate is simple. We need a quantum. For us, Africa is very clear, and many others have very clear. This is 1.4 time frame. It is 2030 and 2035. Instruments are constitutionality. Transparency is what we have in the ATF is Article 9. As simple as that, and I think that the more we add to this process, the more we make it very complicated and doesn't take us forward. If we agree on this first layer of elements, then we can go to the next step. So it will be in your hands, and also identifying how we're going to engage, because we didn't get a chance on explaining how the 1.4 or the 5.4 or 5.6 would come from. And we didn't hear from colleagues, the developed countries who should be providing this, the finance, What is their vision of the quantum? We haven't heard from them anything on their vision of the quantum. And it is very important that when we're sitting here, we're just not looking at the communalities in transparency and the nice rosy word when it comes to the different elements, but on the realities on the ground. And the realities, as per the 100 billion, were very clear again, that most or majority of this 100 billion were loans, which shouldn't be happening in the next goal. And it was time-bound that allowed for the transparency process to kick in. It is also not a process where we are going to compete on our vulnerabilities. It is a very clear process that is going to deliver to all developing countries, and of course taking into consideration the special needs and circumstances of those who are constrained and most vulnerable, of course. But it is not a competition where we're going to say this is more vulnerable than the other one, and this group needs further access. We acknowledge and we know, and we have been doing this process for so many years, so we know what are the challenges when it comes to access, for which groups, for which countries, what is needed to deliver. We have NDCs on the ground that have not been supported. We have conditional NDCs that have not been supported. We have ambition on the ground that has not been supported. Are we dealing with that? Or are we talking about it's the ETFs are very good. Can we enhance our ETFs in 2027 or 2028 so we can have a transparency? This is not delivering. And I've been in this process when developing countries were encouraged to contribute. Now developing countries want to contribute and really expand on their potential to the maximum. And those who are encouraging developing countries to contribute are now reluctant into providing the main component that will allow them to deliver on those ambitions. So, Chair, it's very simple from the African point of view. Developed countries, let's have a discussion on the quantum. It is 1.4 from our point of view, 1.4 trillion per year, based on what we have now on reports. We are not just bringing a number from thin air. And it is to deliver on NDCs. Current NDCs ends in 2030, and the next one, 2035, we will be working on. So is there a willingness to engage on that or not? How I'm going to discuss the transparency of a number that I don't know? How I'm going to discuss the transparency of an instrument that we haven't even discussed? I'll stop there, Chair, so you don't cut me off, but this is very clear from our point of view. It's a quantum for a period of time through specific instruments, and it has a transparency. And we have the delivery channels. We have bilaterals. My question for the developed countries, are you going to have one size fits all to access your bilateral cooperation? I want to hear from those countries. Are they willing to go that? They're going to have the same policy for all developing countries to access their bilateral cooperation? It is not happening. And we have to be realistic. We are not here like just saying words while people are dying in our countries and the temperature increasing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. USA?
Yes, thanks very much, co-chairs. And I'd really like to say that I appreciated the discussions today, but frankly, I think I hopefully echo what many of my colleagues are feeling, because I'm quite frustrated, to be honest. Yesterday, we were asked to engage on commonalities across a couple of key elements, and we, in that context, chose not to repeat our well-known positions at this point, that the new goal, in order to be fit for purpose, needs to be multi-layered and draw from a wide variety of sources, public and private, international and domestic. We didn't repeat that it needs to have an expansive base of contributors that reflect modern economic realities. And we didn't repeat the quantum that we have repeated every other session throughout this meeting, that indeed this is from a floor of 100 billion. And frankly, I'm very happy to discuss the substance on all of these aspects. We came here to this session open and willing to engage with our partners to talk through these issues. And instead, I feel like most of what we've been doing today is repeating views, not going into detail on what folks mean. I would love, Mo, to hear where that 1.4 trillion number came from. I've just gotten a flurry of texts saying, wasn't it 1.3? Has the cost gone up $100 billion between today and yesterday? It would be great to know precisely where that's come from, and I would love to engage and talk about that as well as the way forward here. I imagine I speak for many of us, frankly, in this room, that we all feel that this text is unbalanced, it is flawed, it is missing things, and the proposals are not sufficiently clear for us to engage on them. They are better than they were before, but it is apparent to me that we need to have a step change in this process if we are going to be able to actually discuss the substance of these proposals and move this work forward. So my main question to you all at this stage, rather than repeating our views ad nauseum here, is how do the co-chairs expect to take the work forward from here? Because frankly, I'm not convinced that continuing to engage in this particular mode is worthwhile if this is how we are going to handle these sessions. We are here to be constructive, to engage on these issues. We would like to see a goal which is fit for purpose. Folks know that we've come to the previous meeting and to the technical expert dialogues with proposals, with ideas that we would like to discuss, that we think are workable and we hope meet the needs of all parties here and are indeed a way to establish a goal which is fit for purpose for Paris. And I would love some space to talk that through with folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Frankly speaking, I could have imagined a bit better ways to spend my birthday than in this room listening to frustration and positions. Thank you very much to the co-chairs and everyone else who has wished me a happy birthday. And of course, it's not that I wouldn't want to spend my day with you or my evening. You're very welcome to come to the beer garden tonight for drinks, and I'd love to spend time with you there. But would have really hoped that we could have used the time in this room a bit more effective. I think my group was one of the very, very few that actually did follow the co-chair's instructions and really focus and try to draw out commonalities. We did not repeat our position. You know our positions very well. If you want to read the Swiss position, read the written input to the last TED. It's very well articulated. Happy to explain you all the details over a drink tonight or also outside in the hall. But now we really feel we need to move forward. We need to move towards each other and not back to our positions. And I really, really hope the co-chairs will table a text for us in Baku that allows us to take this step forward. I hope you will be courageous and maybe also make us all a little bit irritated, including my own country and my own group. But I think this is what we need now. We need you to be bold. We need you to use the machete to really get into it and table us something that can bring us a step further. And with this, I would really want to first hear also observers, but also in particular the co-chairs on what we can expect from you over the next few weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you. The last is Arab Group.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And it was not my intention to come back and speak to you. And happy birthday, Gab. Hope you enjoy your evening. But I'm coming back because I have to defend members of my group, and I will not stand idle listening to claims that are not actually true. What's happening in this room right now is a great parallel for the 100 billion. We're being accused as wanting to delete elements of not being constructive, and we're being told to focus on commonalities, on access and transparency, in the guise that that's actually progress. However, and we've been told also, some have raised concerns that there's a disappointment that there's a shortage of time. But I'd like to remind everyone in this room that we all know each other and we can't rewrite history. We've been attending TEDs now, we've had 10 TEDs, and every single time there's been an excuse or another why we can't discuss the quantum, why there haven't been proposals on the quantum. And I also want to make something clear on behalf of my group. We didn't have to travel and expend emissions and costs and come congregate here to read submissions in our room. We want to discuss these submissions. We want to discuss the ideas that we have as different groups, and we want to discuss the ideas from our partners on the quantum and something that's concrete. Many have said, you know our proposal, you know where we're coming from. The truth is, we don't know. We don't know how this abstract concept that's being proposed will translate into reality because it's frankly speaking not concrete. It needs to be concrete. And to be quite honest, from a floor of USD 100 billion, with all due respect, is not a quantum. That's a criteria. So we are willing to engage. We've been asking to engage. And we will not be told here that we are not being constructive because we're asking for deletions of items because of convergences we've had as parties, and that is blocking us from talking about convergences. For us, we're being gaslit. This is not a fair position to put members of our group, and I have an obligation to defend members of my group, and I will do that at every turn. We need now to move to a mode of work where we go into concrete proposals on how different options will work. If there is and let's hear the arguments. Let's hear the ideas. Let's see how this goal will actually work. We are willing to engage on others' proposals, but we need to be convinced. So, for example, we were told in this room that 9.3 is actually allowing all these discussions on, for example, the contributor base because it says developed countries should take the lead. But, okay, convince us. Where's this lead that was taken? Convince us. Paint your picture. The multi-layer. Tell us how it will work. Tell us what the quantum is. Tell us how your vision of the NCQG works in reality. 10 TEDs, 2 meetings of the ad hoc work program, and the only thing that resembles a concrete proposal was just today a slight reference to the H-leg report, a report that says that 1.3 trillion should be invested in developing countries, with 50% coming from domestic resource mobilization, ODA packaged as climate finance, non-concessional funding from MDBs, non-concessional bilateral funding, and over 300 billion from the private sector. It's good. Let's get these ideas out in the open so we can engage with them. For the record, we don't view domestic resource mobilization as part of this mandate. We don't view the private sector as having an accountability to the Paris Agreement. We don't view non-concessional funds as climate finance. We don't view ODA as climate finance. But thank you. Now we can start having the conversation.
Okay, thank you. You've left me a minute to tell you what the next steps are, and unfortunately, observers, as you see how it goes in the room, we'd love to have heard you, but we do not have the time. So colleagues, this is what we're going to do. We'll prepare a summary of the meeting, including information on the progress made and the way forward. We will also initiate preparations for the third meeting. An official notification will be published in due course. Ahead of the third meeting, we will prepare and publish a set of guiding questions for those parties and non-party stakeholders that may wish to make submissions for the third meeting and the 11th technical expert dialogue. In Cartagena, you asked us to prepare an input paper for the second meeting that included your views expressed at the first meeting, as well as the previous submissions and options from the co-chair's annual report. This time, we may ask you to help us prepare the input paper for the third meeting by providing us with submissions that update and consolidate your views on the elements and identify bridging ideas if possible. In this vein, we would particularly encourage you also to reach out to others using the intersessional period to discuss areas where you see fertile common ground. Up until now, we have not seen concrete efforts to reach out to your partners and discuss this. Finally, we will prepare an input paper for the third meeting that will be made available well ahead of the third meeting. The date and the locations will be communicated to you in due course. And before closing, let me iterate that we, Fiona and myself, will continue to make ourselves available for informal bilateral consultations with interested parties and groups of parties upon request. Please contact the Secretariat should you wish to request such informal consultations. In closing, we'd like to thank you all for participating, for your constructive way of participating, as well as the trust you have been showing us up until now. for your views and respectfully listening to others. We wish you all safe travels and look forward to seeing you again at the third meeting under the ad hoc work program. With that, the second meeting under the ad hoc work program is closed. Thank you very much.